Hi everybody, this is going to be the first lecture on arguments. So we've talked a bit about propositions, premises, and conclusions, and non-propositions, and now we're going to talk about arguments and what they are. An argument in logic is not a shouting match. A lot of people think, oh, I got into an argument and my wife was like, you're an idiot, and I was like, no, I'm not. And then the cops came and blah, 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 right? That's not an argument in logic. Now, in everyday usage, people say, I got into an argument, it means a shouting match. But an argument in logic is just a list of propositions. If you're not taking notes, make sure you take notes. Remember, a proposition is a true or false sentence. There are some non-propositions. If you'll remember from last time, questions, commands, and exclamations are non-propositions. But an argument is a list of propositions that support a definite conclusion. And this conclusion must also be a proposition. The conclusion can't be a question, it can't be a command, and it can't be an exclamation. So this is the formal definition of an argument in logic. The informal definition is a shouting match, but a true argument has nothing to do with shouting at all. In fact, the best arguments are usually made in kind of an objective temperament. It's really hard to actually make an objective argument when you're screaming at somebody, although it can be done. Okay, so the propositions that support the definite conclusion are called premises. So an argument must have at least one premise and then a conclusion. So an argument to be an argument technically needs to be two premises. It can't just be, needs to be two statements or two propositions. It can't just be one statement. There's no such thing as a single sentence that's an argument. Now, our minds often create arguments, but they will either add premises or add conclusions. Okay, but the arguments don't necessarily have to just have one premise. So you could have, and actually usually the more premises you have, so long as they're good premises, the stronger your argument is going to be. So you could have multiple premises that support a conclusion. And actually, in an argument itself, a premise might support another premise. So like premise 2 could be the conclusion of premise 1, but the ultimate conclusion would be the final conclusion down here. So when you're analyzing arguments, it's important to be able to identify premises and conclusions. That's the most important thing. So arguments arise in relation to issues. And usually these issues are debatable issues. There's a difference between an argument and an explanation, and that'll be a different lecture. But usually things that are pretty much solidified by scientific knowledge or logical reasoning, things that we all know to be true, are not necessarily going to be an argument. For example, if a meteorologist explains to me why it rains, and they talk about humidity and precipitation and all those things, that's not going to be an argument, it's going to be an explanation. If my doctor tells me why I have cancer, and the doctor has fundamental knowledge that's backed in scientific evidence, that's going to be more of an explanation. It's not going to be an argument. He's not going to be trying to convince me that I have cancer or that these factors led to it. We all tend to realize that if you smoke, it can contribute to lung cancer. So your doctor saying, well, your smoking more than likely contributed to your lung cancer is going to be more of an explanation of why you got the lung cancer rather than an argument that's trying to convince you of the conclusion there that you have cancer. But anyway, arguments are going to be usually in relation to debatable issues. So A debatable issue is one that has multiple positions that you can take. Now, some positions will be stronger than others, but you can choose to take multiple positions on the issue and provide reasons. And issues can often be stated as questions. We all know what contemporary social issues are affecting our nation. So one issue is what is the responsibility of the government to its citizens' health? And I mean, this is kind of a formal way of framing the quote-unquote Obamacare debate, right? Does a government have a duty to provide medical care for its citizenry? Now, and I don't know what the exact percentages are here, but obviously there's a big contingent that say no, that the citizens themselves ought to be responsible for their own medical care. On the opposite side, there are people who say yes, the government ought to provide all services to its citizenry. And then, of course, there's like a more moderate position that would claim people who have resources should have to pay for their health care, or ought to have the opportunity to pay for maybe a higher form of health coverage, but the government itself ought to provide basic services to its citizens that keep everyone alive in relation to treatable illnesses or diseases. Okay, so we framed the issue here, right? So what is the responsibility of the government to its citizens' health? And the answer to the issue question will be the conclusion of your argument. So let's say that you believe that Obamacare is a bad idea and that it's not the responsibility of the government to provide medical coverage for all of its citizens. Then that would be your conclusion. The conclusion of your argument would be, it is not the responsibility, and I'm not going to write it all out again, but it's not the responsibility of the government. I should have said provide here. Okay, the government to provide its citizens. So it's not the responsibility of the government to provide its citizens healthcare services. And that would be the conclusion of your argument. Okay, so what's another issue? Another issue might be how ought one raise one's children? And of course, this is an extremely debatable issue. It depends on a lot of factors. And your answer to this question would be the conclusion of the argument. Okay, so I think hopefully you've got the idea about issues. So whenever you're trying to analyze an argument, let's say somebody's talking to you about taxation. You can start to think like, okay, what is the issue that the person's responding to here? Let's say they're saying to you that the government should not tax people as much. Okay, well, how can we frame that conclusion in terms of an issue? Well, we make it a question, right? And we can just say, should the government tax people more or less? That's kind of an issue. And then the response of that person is the government should not tax people more. And remember, the answer to the issue question is the conclusion. So let's just make one that's not quite as debatable, because it's easy. This is not easy, but dogs are the best animals, right? So that would be our conclusion here. And often in logic, a line separates premises from conclusions. So dogs are the best animals, or we could just say the best pets. So this is the conclusion of our argument. The issue is, what type of pets are best? The answer is dogs are the best. And then what kind of premises might you use to support that? Well, one, dogs are obedient in general and for the most part. Number two, dogs love unconditionally. Number three, dogs can open beer bottles. Actually, I've never seen a dog open a beer bottle, but I have seen dogs retrieve beers from refrigerators, which might be handy for many of us. So for all of these reasons, I believe that dogs are the best pets. So this would be premise 1, premise 2, and premise 3. Dogs are obedient, dogs love unconditionally, dogs can open beer bottles, therefore dogs are the best pets. Now somebody might disagree with this claim, right? And if they were going to disagree, then they would say dogs are not the best pets, and then they would provide information about dogs that indicate that they're not the best pets. And that's a simple argument. That argument probably wasn't very strong. Just because something is obedient doesn't mean that it's best. We would need to do a lot of work to figure out what best means, and things of that nature. And often arguments obviously are not formed of simple discrete sentences and then they give the conclusion. And that's going to be the whole point of many of our activities, is you're going to actually have to find the conclusion and find the premises. So how can you go about doing that? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is conclusion indicator words. So when you get a paragraph, right, and you're trying to piece it out and figure out where's the conclusion, you can look for conclusion indicators. So some of these will probably be really like, no duh, Justin, right? So if you ever see in conclusion, right, that's a conclusion indicator. The word therefore. I don't have any friends, therefore I'm going to watch Louie tonight by myself while I eat cheese. And that's probably actually those are all true statements. Except I do have some friends. Maybe. Okay, so in conclusion, and therefore are conclusion indicator words. Consequently is another conclusion indicator word. Hence. This one we don't use as much, right? At work, in the break room, you probably wouldn't be like, hence, it's the case that we deserve to have an extra 15 minutes at lunch, or whatever. That's kind of like an older form of saying things. Let's see. Oh, here's a good one. I didn't really want to go, so I didn't, right? So I didn't want to go, therefore I didn't. I didn't want to go, consequently I didn't. So is one that we use a lot, actually. This implies that, whoops. The fact that I don't have any friends implies that I'm not a very enjoyable human to be around, okay? So because I'm not a very enjoyable human to be around, I don't have any friends. This proves that, and then this indicates that, ... So these are all things that you should look for in the paragraph to determine whether or not a statement is a conclusion or a premise. Now, it could be the case that a statement is a conclusion that relates to another premise, but the two work together in conjunction to support the final conclusion. And in most of our activities, we're going to be wanting to find the final conclusion, although we will be diagramming arguments, hopefully at some point. And in that case, you label all the propositions with numbers, and you might have two premises working together to support a third premise, but that third premise supports the fourth. So the third would actually be the conclusion of 1 and 2, but the ultimate conclusion of our argument would be 4. And perhaps there's a fifth sentence tacked on at the end that supports 4 directly. So you can see that arguments can get really complex and really difficult to kind of piece out from larger contexts. Okay, so we talked about conclusion indicators, but there are also premise indicator words. Again, remember, premises are the reasons that we have to believe that the conclusion is the case, or that the conclusion ought to be the case. Two of the most important premise indicators are since and because. Now, there could be instances where these words are not actually premise indicators. But usually, if we see the word since or because, these two words indicate that what follows is going to be a premise. Since I'm unhappy in my work, I often take it out on my family or something, right? I've got all these negative things today, don't I? And I don't even have a family, because remember, I don't have any friends. But, and a wife and kids would be friends, or, if I were gay, a partner and kids would be friends. Hopefully, although a lot of times partners are not friends, right? And that's the whole problem. You think you're friends, and then you start hanging out, and you live together. And then, you end up at some point being I can't believe you bought the red peppers again. They're too sweet. I said green peppers. And then you realize I'm screaming at a human being that I love about peppers. There's gotta be something else, right? The subconscious, instinctual drives to destroy or something. You don't just scream at somebody in public about peppers, right? It's so funny, we're so patient with people that we don't even know. And then the people that we do know, it's just ah! My wife tends to hide things from me. So, everything in our house has its place. And then she'll just decide for a new place for the pot to be, right? Or the NutriBullet. And I'll just be looking at its old place, and I'll be like, why did you hide that? The NutriBullet! And she's like, that's not its place. And she's like, I'm not hiding anything from you. And it tends to digress from there. But anyway, as I was saying, since and because are premise indicators. Another one, for. For is another premise indicator word. This is close to the last one, but this is implied by. So for the premise indicators, some proposition, some statement I've just said, is implied by this other proposition that supports the first. Obamacare is going to fail, and I'm not saying that I actually believe one or the other, but anyway, because it was an original example, Obamacare is going to fail, is implied by the fact that people are unwilling to pay higher taxes that are necessary in order to pay for these basic medical needs of the general populace. Okay, so some premise indicators, since, because, for, and this is implied by. Okay, so as we move forward, we're going to talk more. We're going to actually I'm going to put up some arguments, and then we're going to go over them together. But arguments in general are composed of premises and conclusions. Remember that every argument must be at least two statements, so it must be at least two complete sentences. Well, okay, that's not true. They must be two statements, at least one premise and a conclusion. If somebody just states a conclusion, sometimes there are unstated premises. For example, in a syllogism, an unstated premise is called an enthymeme, where you can insert the unstated premise, and our minds often do that, right? So, for example, I might say, well, my father is going to vote for Obama because he's a Democrat. There's actually a hidden premise in that argument. Can you think of that hidden premise? Correct. It's that Democrats will vote for Obama. So Democrats will vote for Obama. My dad's a Democrat, therefore he'll vote for Obama. In our minds, notice how, again, logic is it analyzes these kind of rational, argumentative structures that kind of govern human consciousness. And if I tell you my dad's going to vote for Obama because he's a Democrat, you don't need me to tell you that Democrats vote for Obama, even though if I were to be more formal in my argumentative style, I would need to add that premise. And premises can be of all sorts, and so can conclusions. And the last thing I wanted to do was just talk about some, well, actually, let's just leave that for another video. So, arguments are composed of premises and conclusions. All premises and all conclusions must be propositions or statements. That means they must be true or false sentences. They cannot be questions, they cannot be commands, and they cannot be exclamations. So next time, I think what I'm gonna do is talk about the different types of propositions, just to let you all know, that, for example, a conditional statement, an if-then statement is actually just one premise. It's not two, even though you might think it's two. An and statement is actually two premises, even though it's contained in one sentence. So if I say to you, I'm happy and I'm kind of sad, then really that there are two propositions located or contained within that single sentence. Justin is happy, Justin is sad. However, if I were to say to you, I'm happy or I'm sad, which one is it, right? In an or statement, the whole or statement is just a single proposition because you're not stating that both are the case. Although there are some other issues when it comes to truth values of or statements, where both being the case actually means that the whole thing is true, which is a little counterintuitive for some students. And if you didn't understand that last part, don't worry about it. I was just nerding out. But anyway, okay, so thanks for watching, and we'll have another video soon.